Recording is going. Okay, you're all set.
Okay, excellent. Okay, welcome everyone to today's talk by ACE, the Hispanic American Cultural Effort, USDA. We want to welcome you all for today's presentation by Mr. Charles Mann on the effects of colonization on agriculture and natural ecosystems. We're very grateful with Mr. Mann for agreeing to share with us all his magnificent work. Mr. Mann, just a brief introduction. He's a journalist and scientific writer. He's author of multiple books, and also is a normal contributor for scientific magazines, just like Wired, Science, among many others. He's also been a recipient of the multiple writing awards, included the National Academy Communications Award, and also 3 times finalist for the Natural Magazine Award. We want to welcome you and thank you again, Charles, for joining us. Before we get started, I want to remind everybody this is going to be recorded thanks to Mr. Mann agreeing, and it's going to be posted later on the ASE website for those of you that need to leave early or for people that couldn't attend today. Also, we want to keep it mute except for Mr. Mann speaking. And then at the end, if you have any questions, we may have 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the talk for some Q&A. Just type them out on your chat and we will pick some at random to ask Mr. Mann at the end of the presentation. Also, if you're joining audio by phone, if you press star 9, you will get the signal. And if later on you want to speak, star 6 will be the code. Thank you. Thank you, Charles. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. When I initially wrote out my talk, I realized that it was going to be like an hour and a half long. So I dramatically cut it, and I'm just going to sort of give you the basic ideas in the hope that anything that you find interesting, we can talk more about in the Q&A, which is always the most interesting part of any talk. So what I'm going to do is give you a little background and then quickly go over a few ideas, and in particular one overarching idea, and then open it up for questions. I'm relatively rarely do I give talks. I mostly listen, so excuse me if I bungle the sharing the screen in the next couple of minutes, because it's something I haven't done very much. I'm hoping you can see this. Do I have any feedback?
Yes, sir, we do. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, so most of you probably in one way or another have been influenced by this guy, even though if you may have never heard of him. He was an American historian. His name was Frederick Jackson Turner. He's probably the most influential historian who ever lived in the Americas. And his importance derives mainly from a single essay he wrote in the 1890s called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And he basically invented the idea of the frontier, and most important, invented the idea that American history of all sorts is marked by this progression from east to west, where the Europeans come and wipe out whatever was there before. And
sorry, Alan, can you make your slide full screen, because you have a couple things going on your screen and we're blocking the slide. Right. Matter of fact, go out and come back in one more time, because it looks like we're seeing another Zoom window. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Charles, I think it's showing one window on top of the slides right now. So you can minimize the one where you showing up. Yeah, there you go. And then
okay.
make the
As
one
I
on
said,
the left bigger.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that.
I haven't done this often. My apologies, but I hope you were able to hear what I was talking about. It's really just this guy's mugshot, and the point is that when my son goes to his high school history lessons, he is basically learning a kind of modified version of Frederick Jackson Turner, which is that Europeans come. This is the beginning of history as far as Americans come. And there's this movement from east to west in which the East sort of takes over the West and wipes out everything that was there before. I'm going to say that, and this is embodied, actually, Turner's ideas were embodied in the kind of popular art of the time. Here is an example of a super popular late 19th century drawing that's been found in many, many American households. And you can see, again, Colombia, that's this person in the toga is bringing civilization, which is light, the East from the darkened West. The bison are running away, the Indians are running away, and technology and agriculture are moving in. And again, the implication is that there was no technology, there was no agriculture, the Indians have disappeared, the bison have disappeared. And that is pretty much what kids learn to this very day. You know, when I went to high school, I still have my 8th grade American high school textbook. This was one of the pictures in the front showing Daniel Boone escorting settlers through the Cumberland Gap. And again, this is the image that is, I think, pretty much prevalent and held by 90+% of the American public. And if you draw it in a map, what it shows is that there's only 2 real movements in American history. You know, in the first few pages of the history textbook, they'll show 13,000 years ago that there's these native people who came in across the Bering Straits. Then there's a big gap until about 200 years ago when people go from east to west. What I'm going to tell you is that there's a profoundly important part of American history, one that we really need to think about in every way, and particularly given the kind of environmental and agricultural challenges we're going to have, which started about 2,500 years ago and lasted right up to the Civil War, in which the movement of American history in every way was dominated by movement from the South into the North. And the history from the South means we're talking about indigenous and Hispanic influences. The 3 big ones are agriculture, you know, which is maize, the milpa, the landscape modification. That's the great bulk of what I'm going to talk about. Then towards the end of that, the introduction of the horse, an ecological competitor, bison. It was an agent of de-agricalization that dramatically destabilized indigenous societies in the 17th century. And along with that, disease brought in by these Spaniards and brought up north. And disease is largely the reason that the entire western part of the United States was conquered and is responsible for the imposition of European landscape-style landscape management. In this talk, I'm almost 100% focused on agriculture for obvious reasons. And we can talk about number 2 or 3 if you want to later on in the questions. And so the beginning of agriculture really in the Americas is with the dramatic modification of teosinte, this sort of roadside grass, into maize, a process that's still not really well understood, but one that created this enormously productive and extremely strange crop that just doesn't look like other cereals and doesn't behave like other cereals. Interestingly, the latest archaeological evidence suggests that it was not cultivated as a grain initially, but for the sap to produce tizguino or tahino, a kind of a low alcohol beverage still made in places in northern Mexico. You take the maize stalks, you pound them into pulp. I don't know if you've ever had young maize stalks. You bite into them, they're quite sweet. You pour that through mash, you collect and boil the juice, and you ferment it. And if you add a little bit of germinated grain or peyote, you can up the kick. But typically, it's about 1 or 3%, and it was a widely used sort of beer-like beverage for thousands of years. And only later, it seems, did the grain become important. Now, one of the primary things we have to talk about when you talk about the impact of agriculture, throughout the North American West, is that it occurred in agriculture originated in quite a different kind of landscape. On the right on my screen, you see Karasha Daj. This is the origin of European agriculture. It's a field of wild einkorn wheat. And as you can see, it's a monoculture. It looks like a farm field, except it has these rocks in it. Now you look at the Maya lowlands, which is the real origin point of North American agriculture, and you see it's a wet, humid, tropical forest that is anything but a monoculture. And to some extent, these differing origins explains the differing trajectories of American and European agriculture, and is a point, I would argue, of profound importance in figuring out what we're going to do in the future. Because it came up in this sort of super species-rich environment, it came up with a different kind of agriculture, the milpa or polyculture. It's very difficult to take a picture of. This is two sort of sample milpa plots grown in cement, a couple of years ago. But basically, you burn part of the forest, and then you plant a polyculture that reproduces, in many ways, the functions of the forest that it is replacing. So you have, maize, but also up to 20 species along with it. And very, very important, it's intercropped with tree crops. And so you have this entire artificial landscape that is so different from European agriculture that when the Spaniards first saw it in the 16th century, they didn't even understand that this was farms. And this kind of polyculture then spread across all of North America, right up to here where I am in Massachusetts, originating in the Maya. And the species changed. Of course, corn, bean, and squash, stayed the same, but the other mixes, but the principles stayed the same. And so when you look at the American landscape, it's important to remember that it's been farmed for thousands of years by a completely different system than was the case in Europe. And the ecological history of the last couple hundred years is the imposition of a new kind of agricultural system into a landscape that often really wasn't prepared for it because it had been so used to farming in the other ways. So the trick with maize is that it starts in the very humid parts of Mexico about 9,000 years ago, and then has to be very, very slowly adapted to much drier landscapes in the North American Southwest, in Arizona, in New Mexico and Chihuahua, and that area. And this process of very slow evolution takes about 5,000 years, during which these areas are continuously being farmed. And to bring the milpa, to bring this kind of polyculture up, what people have to do is not only breed more drought-tolerant crops and so forth, but they also learn new systems of modifying the landscape. And the landmark in that is here in Cerro Guanaquiena in northwest Chihuahua. And this is a large terraced hill that started terraced about 1300 BC. And it's essentially been changed. The entire hills have been changed into a water retention system. The terraces that go along it were edged with all, agave and other types of crops. Maize was planted in between. And the entire thing is a kind of vertical farm that's quite unlike anything that is, again, seen in Europe. With that evolution came canal irrigation, something that's quite familiar in many places around the world. And so both of these are essentially methods of taking small amounts of water and distributing. One sort of harvests the water of rainfall, that's the terraces, and the other takes water from rivers and streams. But they get mixed up. And so that you have these extraordinary canal networks all throughout the Southwest. Probably the most extraordinary of them are the hanging canals in the Safford Basin, in which in the valley of the Gila River, in the foothills of Mount Graham, covering quite a large area in southeast Arizona, you have people harvesting all the water off of Mount Graham, which is this very tall mountain, in these many, many miles of canals. And they're hanging canals, which means that they don't follow the contours of the landscape. They cut at a constant angle, usually about 1.5 degrees across landscape. And what this means is that they are able both to irrigate from the Gila River itself, but also harvest the water off of the mountains for irrigation. And the striking thing for our purpose to remember is that during the time of the 13th century, when there was record droughts, when it was it was the kind of weather that we're heading towards, the population density of the canal irrigated place was larger than it is today. The cities of Safford and Thatcher and so forth are more densely populated, but the countryside was more populated, and there is greater agricultural production than there is today by the system of water harvesting. Today we have a system like this, which is, essentially water is channeled from large rivers and brought in this way. I'm going to argue that this is something that we're not going to be able to do, and that we should start looking at the ways that the people from the South, also reinforced by ideas from Hispanic, came and agriculture, and see that we can build on. So what you have in the Southwest, you can see here, is this large areas with irrigation networks, canal complex in some of the driest areas now of the Southwest, and it was entirely done without importing new water from, say, the Colorado River. In other words, done by a system of extensive agriculture that was harvesting the water that was available in the landscape rather than importing it from far away. And you ended up with these extraordinarily densely populated areas between about 800 and about 1300. The San Juan River Basin in the Four Corners area, it had hundreds of thousands of people, even though it was going through extreme droughts. So we're looking at a system that was highly successful. And the earliest visitors to the area, here's a guy named Mack visiting a Hopi farm. We're struck by the way that rainwater was harvested. And so you have a mesa top in a Hopi farm, and the water channeled through multiple crops, ending up in the tree crops. And so this is an entire landscape. By the rivers, they created these waffle gardens, which allowed you to and are still being used today, which allow people to do kind of intensive cultivation. But even in high areas where these heavy southwestern rainfall would come in, they would create these lines of stones that would interrupt the course of the rainfall and allow water to percolate in and create these sort of extensive gardens. Similarly, these have been shown in places like Niger today, and they're called zai there, these lines of stones, and they've been able to use them to reclaim and reforest much of the areas that were lost in the 70s and 80s to desertification. So these are very simple but extremely powerful techniques. And the result that you get are these wildly extensive farms that are low yield per acre, but are able to produce quite a lot of food while keeping the landscape intact. And so this is Hopi corn here. It's a special drought resistant variety. It never gets any taller than this. And it's something that is planted for miles and miles across the Southwest in areas that are now abandoned. And along with this, you have also something that the Spaniards came in, which are silvopastoral systems. And these are systems in which trees and cattle are mixed in with the kind of extensive agriculture, and improve the soil. And so in places like the Sonora, where this is taken, you are able to have tree crops mixed in with cattle crops in areas that are simply running out of water for conventional wheat of the sort that Norman Borlaug invented. And these also have enormous systems. These agroforestry systems are really good also for maintaining soil carbon. So these are the kinds of things that I was really hoping we could have a discussion about, because the point of all this, as I hope that I've been able to communicate, is that the agricultural systems that were developed first by indigenous people and then by indigenous people combining things with the Hispanic cultures that came in, brought in alternative forms of agriculture that may be more suited to the kind of climate that we're facing when, as seems clear, we're heading into one of the mega droughts that have recurred throughout Southwestern history and that are the future of agriculture. And this is really all I came to talk to you about. And I would be really happy to answer any questions that you might have, or talk about the kind of research that's being done. And Alan, how do we handle a discussion here?
I have access here for the questions and answers, and so I'll be reading some of the questions in there. I wanted to start with something that came to my mind after reading your book 1493, and that's what the Spaniards, or the in this case the Anglo-Saxons and everything, came to the East Coast. They encounter a system that wasn't ideal, and very different to what you were mentioning for the Southwest. So how was that transition from, I can read in that book, they struggle in order to survive, and sometimes they got help from the indigenous, and it was a continuous struggle, but the system there kind of related to what you found, what you were describing for the Southwest, but it was not quite the same. So how that transition happened?
So what they had were, then were these gardens that were, from the European point of view, almost unrecognizable as gardens. This is because they weren't monocultures, they weren't fenced, and there's a combination of these polycultural annuals. So you'd have, corn, beans, and squash, famously, sometimes with sunflower added, and then they would move after a couple of years and manage the succession of what happened next. And so that would be, so you'd have semi-domesticates like blueberries, blackberries, and that kind of a crop growing up in these quote unquote abandoned gardens. And then they would manage the succession of the trees, so, and particularly so that you'd have trees that have what are called mast, which are nut type trees. The most important of these was chestnut. And because of the continual manipulation of the landscape over hundreds and hundreds of years, the result is that when Europeans came in, about 1 out of every 4 trees in east of the Appalachians was a chestnut tree. And this is particularly important because chestnuts are extremely nutritious and just unbelievably productive. And back in the 30s, when there were still extant chestnuts left, the USDA surveyed some of them and found that these trees, which remember are completely unimproved, they're just trees that are out there. A single large chestnut tree was capable of producing enough protein and nutrition to support a family for a year. So what they did is, instead of fencing off areas into farms, they created entire kind of edible landscapes. And these had some definite drawbacks from the European point of view, in that they were so extensive, they required more labor and so forth. And so the Europeans are minimizing labor by concentrating production into small areas. But what it did do was spread out risk. And so that if your maize failed, you had the chestnuts. If there was a bad period for the chestnuts and so forth, you could you could do the semi-domesticates and the maize. And so by doing this, it was a tremendous hedging mechanism, and it kept people pretty well off. And it's something we should think about now as we are entering a period, in my view, as we are entering a period in which climate change is making it more and more difficult to predict what's going to happen in any individual part of our weather in any individual place.
Thank you, Charles. We have several questions. I'm going to start with some that are related with the problem of water that you were mentioning in your slides. And somebody wonders if you show how these recovery slides were useful and actually provide for that resource for many people in in kind of dry areas. But how possible is to kind of go back to this technology in a system of production that is mechanized, like the one we live in today?
That's the obvious and very, very good question. And the answer is, to some extent, if I give you an answer, I'm trying to predict the future, and that's always a mug's game, and you probably shouldn't do that. So let me try to say this. Looking at the principles of this kind of agriculture doesn't mean embracing the means, the exact means that we don't necessarily have to pile up stones or something like that. And we certainly don't have to do it by human labor. One of the things that I would argue is that so much of our agricultural research is focused on these sort of traditional European methods of with cereal crops and so forth, that this kind of stuff has been almost entirely neglected for these century or so since the agricultural research really began in this country. And so the good part about that is that diminishing returns is not yet set in. And I would argue that if you were able to, as agricultural scientists, say, well, how can we reproduce the features of this form of agriculture that are desirable using modern methods and technology, that would be a really fruitful, there's a good chance that would be a really fruitful area of inquiry. And a young, ambitious scientist might find something more there than being the person who is the 400th PhD on the C4 Rice Initiative or something like that. Does that make any sense what I'm arguing?
Yes. And then related to that, we have a question that may deal with part of that and maybe something new. And it will be, in your opinion, what will be the major challenges to accommodate this new technology using the knowledge from previous cultures, like the cultures in the Southwest and so. I guess the environment where you're doing it is one of the big ones, but what other things you see as probably an impediment for adapting these technologies with current technology into agricultural systems?
Well, right now, it's almost none of these kind of systems have people looked at mechanizing agriculture at all. And so you see this if you go to there's a number of farms in the Southwest where people are experimenting with trying to do exactly that. They're all tremendously underfunded, which is the reason that I gave a big plug for funding. And what you see is that they all require tremendous amounts of labor, and I just don't think that it's possible to use that much labor and have the system sustainable at all. So that's a huge challenge, is finding ways to mechanize it so it's not quite so much backbreaking work. I think it can be done. The kind of mechanization that we have now is extraordinarily sophisticated, but it hasn't been done, and that would be a giant challenge for it. I guess the good thing is that we kind of have a gun to our head in that if the people like like Benjamin Cooks and his team at Columbia are right about the kind of drought that we're facing in the Southwest, we're going to really need to make some changes, and this might spur us to looking into that. I'm sorry, that's my dog barking at somebody who's come before. I guess this is the drawback of Zoom meetings. My apologies.
That's okay, thank you. If we still have time, there's some other question, Charles. I don't know. Yeah. So
sure. It's the questions are I don't unlike a regular meeting where I can't see people's faces, so I don't really know what people are interested in. So questions are the best way to make sure that I try at least to address something that you might be interested in.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things with colonization is the the intensification and the monoculture, so to say. So how you say, in these new ideas and the problems we face is like climate change, going back to ancient cultures in terms of they have systems that were diversified, not just one single crop. Would you see that as an alternative to face these challenges, or what can we learn from ancient, inhabitants of the North America in this regard?
Well, so take a look at Sonora, where I spent some time a couple of years ago. That's the birthplace of the Green Revolution. It's where Norman Borlaug developed, his wheat, and it's a really, which is obviously a really remarkable development. I wrote a book that was partly about that, and that was why there. But they're also running out of water, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to grow Green Revolution wheat in the birthplace of the Green Revolution. Yet, if you go just a little bit, further into the hills, you see the Yaqui there, who lived there forever and have been working on a kind of mixture of Hispanic and indigenous process called silvopastoralism, where they're growing tree crops and annuals. Not annuals, perennials, like agave and so forth, and letting cattle graze in there. And by using the cattle produce manure, they don't eat the trees, and you end up with a system that is, from the perspective of a single crop, it doesn't produce that much cattle, it doesn't produce that much agave, it doesn't produce that much of the palms, but when you add them all up together, that produces an impressive number of calories. And the entire system, again, has not been studied in anywhere close to the depth that, say, wheat farming has been. And so it's really almost wild in a sense. And it's hard for me to believe that, with the extraordinary talent of places like USDA, and of course they have the same in Mexico, that this system couldn't be optimized and become even more productive while maintaining its essential characteristics, which are that it can function with very little water.
Great, thank you, Charles. One of the participants here is wondering about the last slide that you presented. Is it possible for you to explain a little bit better that last slide?
Again, this is all part of a giant longer talk. One of the things that's really striking about tree cropping systems is that they're really good at preserving soil carbon. And that's, of course, another issue that we're facing in contemporary agriculture. And so this was a study came out a couple of years ago. It's a meta-analysis of a whole lot of studies of tree cropping systems throughout the world. And what it shows is that almost no matter what you do, and almost no matter what the system, tree cropping systems are better at building up soil carbon and soil organic matter than annual cereal type of agriculture. And I'm happy to show you the reference. It's really quite a striking piece of work, and it was thought-provoking.
Thank you, Charles. One more question, if we have the time. If you can please provide more details or description of the waffle gardens that you were talking about and how they work in terms of water and everything.
Okay, so the waffle gardens, one of the things that you have in these soils is trying to keep the water around long enough for it to soak into the soil and not just run off, causing the tremendous erosion, which is something that you see all over these dry areas, and of course, it's going to be an increasingly important phenomenon as the rest of the West dries out. And so waffle gardens essentially do two things. You build up shade so that the crops can grow, and sprout in less harsh sunlight, because the walls are tall enough to cut off some of the sunlight. And it also allows you to just, pour in small amounts of water and keep. And so they use them for kind of intensive gardening. You see that around around people's houses and so forth. Those are the smaller gridded ones. The larger gridded gardens are usually in the long ago, hundreds of years ago, were a couple of meters on a side, and they're made of stones. And what happens in these upland mesas is that when there are these rainfalls are pretty intense and they just wash right over the land, the stones interrupt that and slow it down, which allows the water to percolate more, always a good thing, but also they trap any of the organic matter that's been washing around. And you'll find, then what you find is that the lines of stone, especially on the slightly downhill side, become places where plants of all sorts grow and they build up towards it. And so each little square becomes a kind of ecosystem. And so they then will plant, cactus or something like that, agave again around the edges, and use that to trap water. So then you can plant corn in the middle of the squares, and you cover huge areas with this, and you start being able to grow some crops. Again, it's a very, very different system than we have now, but one that worked for centuries and took fairly dense populations through the worst droughts that we know of in the Southwest.
Thank you. Yeah, one other thing that you have in one of your first slides was the effects of disease on this process of colonization. Yes. Like how that, in one of your books you mentioned how that was an impediment first for the colonists to conquer the southeast U.S. because malaria and yellow fever imported from the eastern hemisphere.
Right.
But would you say that these same diseases that also kind of wipe out, along with the common flu, wipe out local tribes and everything, will be one of the reasons why this system finally end up taking hold and replace this other system, because the people basically was gone, or the knowledge was gone? Or how would you put it? How can you associate that process of moving west with the introduction of diseases? Like it probably was different to what happened on the east, or the same, or what are your take on that?
So a couple of things happen. It's sort of fascinating and awful. Europeans introduced the diseases, the most important of which was smallpox. In the 1670s and 1680s, they had also introduced the horse, and the horse by the 1670s and 80s had escaped Spanish control and was all over the West, and so facilitating communication as the way the horse does everywhere. When disease happened, when an epidemic broke out in Mexico City in the 1670s, it was transported by people on horse, who didn't inadvertently, of course, all the way up to Canada. And the result was a huge smallpox epidemic in the 1680s that reached, from Mexico City to the Pacific Northwest to Alberta and Saskatchewan. We don't, know how many people died. We do know that in epidemics where people have been able to count in India and places like that, that untreated smallpox, which this effectively was, kills about 40% of the people who get it. So something like a third of the people in the American West died in that epidemic, which is and we've seen how much, a much smaller death tally has disrupted U.S. society in the last year, unfortunately. So you can imagine, a death tally, 100 times larger or something in this area. And it was just awful for these societies. And it permitted Europeans to march into these disrupted societies. But it didn't permit them to do that everywhere. And in particular, the Comanche, who are in Western Texas and parts of New Mexico, they figured out what was going on, and they created essentially what the doctors call cordon sanitaire. And they said in this, they knew it came from Europeans. They said in this region, Comancheria as it's called, we're not letting in Europeans. And so they created this area that cut New Spain, which was the Spanish Empire, in two. And so there was Texas on one side and the rest of it on the other. And this is the reason, essentially, that Texas became an independent nation, because it was cut off by the Comanche and beneath them by the Apache from the rest of New Spain. There's a sort of a comic history with that. One of the things that struck me as I was reading about the attempts to say what you can say in Texas passing these laws about what you can say and not say in the schools, something to do with critical race theory or something. But one of the things they apparently still let you say, because they don't even want to mention it, is the awful truth that when Texas declared and became an independent nation, its first thing it did was fight a war against the Comanche, which it terribly lost. And the treaty that it signed was so humiliating that the Texas government collapsed. And at that point, they petitioned to be part of the United States. And they said they would be part of the United States. It's a quite funny petition if you read it. In sort of paragraph 11, they started, if and only if you do something about the Comanche, which in turn was related to their desire to have a disease-free zone. This would have continued, I think, and the entire Southwest would have effectively not been part of the United States, except that in the 1860s, smallpox finally got in there and broke the Comanche. And then in the next 15 years or so, they were incorporated into Texas. That's the kind of way that disease plays a big role in the history.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Charles. Two questions in one to end up the talk. We don't want to take so much of your time. And they both have to do with the ancient systems of crops and all this lost technology. One is if there's any efforts by private institutions or government that you know of in trying to recover those techniques and apply them to current times. And secondly, if you know, what resources would you recommend to people to visit this kind of information, to go and find out more for what may be something like a small scale farmers and things like that?
These are really questions. And there are, a number of very small sort of state type, institutions, and maybe small federal ones. The federal government has a whole raft of different things it does, and I'm not aware of all of them. But basically, what I can tell you is that there's very, very little, research into this that goes on in places like UC Davis or the big agricultural schools, and that most of it is done not by agricultural researchers, but by archaeologists and by geographers. And so there's a geographer named Doolittle who has tracked. He wrote an amazing book. See if here. This is a good starting point. I don't know if you can read it. It says Cultivated Landscapes of Native North America. And it's just a record of, you can see all the little Post-its I have here, because I think it's an amazing book. And it's just a record of all the archaeological discoveries of where these cultivated landscapes were and how they worked. And similarly, he's a geographer. Similarly, there's an archaeologist named Anschutz, who's in Albuquerque now, Kevin Anschutz, who has been studying for 30 years the locations of these in the Southwest, and these some of the photographs that I used are from him. What has not typically been the case is for them to team up with agricultural scientists who really understand, growing things and how that works. It seems to me that would be a really fruitful, lens to do it, to take the knowledge from the archaeologists and combine it with the knowledge of agronomists and agricultural researchers. Everyone would be very excited to read that.
Correct. Yeah, and regarding resources that you can, besides the book, any organizations or institutions that are working on this regard, on these ancient techniques and applications with current technologies, or it's all on the works or not really materialized in a way.
There's a lot of individuals who are interested, but there isn't any kind of, they don't get much institutional support. So for instance, the Hopi have a thing called ZYEP, I forget, Zuni Youth Employment or something. And that is where they get essentially older farmers to teach younger Hopi how to build these gardens and so forth. And I showed a picture actually from them. And similarly in Santa Clara Pueblo, there's a rather amazing woman named Roxanne Swensel, who has been established with a guy named Clayton Brascoupé, a sort of permaculture with the Santa Clara Permaculture Institute or something like that, which is in effort to just do some experimentation along exactly these lines. And she's got they have a number of small farms where they're just testing out combinations of crops and techniques to see how you can make modern versions of older farms with this. But these are all very small scale. There's a woman who's at Berkeley who's writing a book that's trying to compile stuff from this all over the place. There's a guy named Emigdio Ballon, also in the Southwest at Tezuque Pueblo, I think, who's attempting to create a seed bank to test traditional drought related crops. But these are all, as I said, small scattered things. And it would just be wonderful if it were done in conjunction with people like the USDA with the fabulous knowledge and technical skill that is there.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Charles. We really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your research and your work with us at the USDA ASE. And we hope we can have you some other time in the future too.
Sure. And I very much appreciate you letting an amateur in here and your generosity in letting me spout off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a great one. Thank you.
Bye-bye.